Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast, and now more than ever, independent media needs the support of our listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to the bonus content. Also, there are both audio and video versions of the show that you can find on various platforms, and in most cases, the video version has added maps, images, video clips, and things that enhance the content, so you might want to check those out if you're interested. On today's show, the host of ADVChina YouTube channel and podcast, Winston Sterzel, aka Serpentza, and Matthew Tye, aka Sea Milk or Lao Y86, join us, and they have lived and traveled through most of China for more than a decade. They started a custom motorcycle business, and they did most of that traveling on those cycles, and they produced 2 documentary films. Their video and podcast content, they have individual channels as well as the ADVChina channels. The content is broad-ranging, but mostly about life in China from a Westerner's perspective. And the more recent content has a lot of information about how things have changed. Both Winston and Matt, married, have extended families in China and in their home countries of South Africa and the United States, and they left China for the United States in the past couple of years after witnessing a significant transformation in China. We talk about that transformation, what life in China was like when they first moved there, and how things are now. We talk about the real estate bubble, the Evergrande crisis, the Xi Jinping anti-corruption campaign, and then we discuss the escalating hostility between China and the United States and its allies. And in a bonus question, we discuss whether or not China is becoming an imperial power, quote unquote, with Chinese characteristics, and more. Welcome to Around the Empire. We have 2 special guests that I'm really excited to talk about. They're from ADVChina, and this is Winston and Matt. And thank you so much. It's so great to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
If you would, take just a couple minutes to tell us about yourself, if you would.
Okay, well, I'll start since I suppose I got to China before Matt did, a couple of years before. And when I landed in China, the first time I went was on a business trip. Very quick, long story short, went on a business trip, loved it, decided that's where I wanted to be. And I flew back home, sold everything, ended up in China, just with no clue, trying to figure out how I could stay. Actually ended up homeless for a couple of days, went through a lot of trials and tribulations, and finally landed on my feet and kind of figured China out the hard way. And then started to make YouTube videos, which I wasn't aware of at the time, but I was the first person to ever start making YouTube videos out of mainland China.
Wow.
And so it went from there.
Yeah, similar story with me. I didn't go on a business trip. I was just kind of bored out of college, just finished college. And I figured, hey, why not do some more traveling? I had just finished backpacking through Europe, and I wanted to extend that kind of feeling. And I figured out that you can actually teach abroad for like a gap year. So I planned on doing that in Taiwan. I had some friends from Taiwan, thought it sounded kind of cool. Didn't plan on going to mainland China, but I ended up putting up my resume on the internet, and it wasn't hiring season for Taiwan, but I ended up getting a call from a small school in mainland China that really paid almost nothing. But for some bizarre reason, I just felt overcome with this idea that, hey, I might as well try it out. So again, sold my stuff, bought a plane ticket, figured I'd do a year or two, maybe abroad, and then come back home, and ended up spending 10 years there in mainland China. Fell in love with the country. And both Winston and I actually met through YouTube. I was probably the second guy to make YouTube videos in China.
Very close.
So we ended up starting a motorcycle company together. We built custom motorcycles and ended up traveling across pretty much the entire country on the back of custom built motorcycles, and shot 2 documentaries together.
Yes.
And we kind of ended up just working together from then on.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. For so many reasons. Like, I first came across you because I love the people who give tours in other countries and just, take you along with them. I just really love that format. Plus, I'd never seen these parts of China, ever. Has anybody else sort of done this kind of thing as far ranging as you have?
No, absolutely not. You see, the thing is, the Chinese government has an imperative to only show off the good parts of China. So if there's ever a documentary or some kind of, legitimate, if the BBC goes there, for instance, and they're going to shoot a documentary, they are subject to the Chinese censors, and they're subject to basically, fixers and so on, have to take them around and only show them specific spots. You're not allowed to go and just randomly film in China. You need permits and that kind of thing. But we kind of skirted that by kind of doing it in a different way. And we rode around on our motorcycles with GoPros and things like that. And we just filmed what we saw. And it's kind of rare for a foreigner to get out of the main cities in China, because when you arrive in China, it's set up in such a way that it isolates you from the countryside. You have your big city centers, which are always very impressive, with skyscrapers and lights and everything. And then if you want to travel somewhere, they've got high-speed rails, they've got buses, and that's basically your only choice. Is you get on a train, you get on a bus, and you go from a fancy train station to another fancy train station in another city, and that city will be famous for some kind of tourist attraction, maybe some beautiful mountains or something. So you'll arrive there, and then as a foreigner, to get anywhere, it's very difficult unless you speak the language and you really know what you're doing. So you'll end up getting on a bus or something, going to that tourist attraction and staying in a hotel which only allows foreigners, which are always the better hotels. Because believe it or not, you still can't stay in any hotel in China. If you're a foreigner, most of the small hotels in the rural areas are not allowed to have foreigners stay in them. So you get this kind of bubble experience. If you're a foreigner in China, you don't get to see the real rural countryside. You don't get to really interact with the people. So all you end up seeing are fancy cities and beautiful tourist attractions, and that's kind of it. So like I said, we skirted around that and we got to see everything.
And Joanne, I think that's a good question to ask. That's why I chuckled, because I think that we were really lucky to get away with what we did. At that time, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it's certainly a lot easier than now. It's basically impossible to do what we did now, because at that time, it was kind of where China was in this golden period of, are we going to open up, or are we going to continue closing off? It was that weird interim period. And we kind of took advantage of that by being able to speak Chinese and flying under the radar. We never stayed in one place for too long. We never, asked people super, super sensitive questions or whatever. And, we stayed out of places like Tibet and Xinjiang at that time. That being said, we did run into massive problems towards the end, where we had the SWAT team bust into our hotels. We would get interrogated by detectives. We would be asked over and over again in separate rooms, like, what are you doing here? Why are you filming? Blah, blah, blah. We'd show them proof. But even then, there was so much paranoia in the air that we were going to document some bad, dastardly thing about China that they basically forced us out of the country. And it was a real shame, because we feel like, at least our videos and our documentaries at the time, were a very, very much a love letter to China and its people. And like you said, the places that you might not have seen in other travel documentaries, because you have to live there for a long period of time to know where to go and who to talk to and what to talk about, how to survive. So I think China, the Chinese government, in its ultimate paranoia of wanting to just show the pristine, shiny examples of everything, like what you see now. If you see anybody doing shows or documentaries or videos in China right now,
even YouTube videos,
it's passed through government censors. It's owned by state media. And China just makes sure that people are showing only the things that they want them to see. And I think that's a massive disservice to the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I noticed that. I had seen some of your work, but not all of it. And over the last several weeks since we set this up, I've been looking through it more chronologically. Mm-hmm. And there's a stunning evolution that happens. It's very clear what your attitudes are and your excitement in the beginning, and then how, well, I don't know if I actually got to the part where things started getting really bad and when that transition happened. But yeah, your words now, your cautionary words, your descriptions of how things have changed. I'm learning a lot about that. Just to give you a little, this isn't really that important, but just like to give you a little bit of background, the people who listen to this podcast, the supporters of the show, there's a Discord server, and so there's always chatter going on. And we probably one of the biggest topics we talk about is China. And we have sort of an across the board and lots of people sort of in the middle still learning attitudes toward China. And not a lot, but we do have a couple of patients who actually have lived there too. So, it's always pretty interesting. I've never been to China. I have been to Hong Kong though. And I've been to parts of Hong Kong out in the New Territories, way out in the New Territories, like the last stop, which I now think, I'm not exactly sure where it was, but anyway, this is like 30 years ago though. I'm like not long out of college. My company was setting up a warehouse way out in the New Territories. And I had to go and set up a computer system there. I was an industrial engineer and in IT. And so I saw a stark difference between like the hotel, the beautiful hotel that I stayed in on the harbor, and then the area way out in the New Territories, very poor, wonderful people all across the board, but just a huge difference. Now, I understand that area is entirely different now, with Xinjiang is now the Chinese Silicon Valley. So anyway, so I have a little bit of an experience with that difference. The other thing is that my Chinese American friends, I think, are mostly from the cities, except there's one young family that I got to know, and she told me stories. Her family's from a rural area, and her stories about what life was like in China were entirely different than others. So I am aware of it, and it makes me even more curious and confused, to be honest. So I was very happy to see the plus I just like rural areas as well. I mean, I've always lived in suburbia outside of Philadelphia, lived in some other places, but mostly urban areas. And also the listeners of the show were like, we got to talk, try to talk to these guys. And so I'm very happy that you agreed to do that. Now, some other topics that we talk, well, anyway, I should stop because maybe you have some things to say there.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say there. If you want to talk about the difference between the cities and the countryside, you will find that a lot of the people that end up immigrating do come from the cities, and that's because of the hukou system, which is like a residence-based system. If you're born in a rural countryside area, you're basically given a passport in a way. It's like a domestic passport. And so if you try to go and work and live in the cities, it's incredibly difficult to do so because you have this passport. So while you've got this hukou, you're not entitled to schooling in the cities. You're not entitled to social programs in the cities, like health, health insurance and things. There's so many things you cannot do, and it kind of pigeonholes you and kind of holds you stuck in the rural areas. So it's very difficult for somebody coming from a poor rural background to ever get to the point where they can leave and go overseas.
And there's a flip side to that as well, is that a huge chunk of those people do abuse or break the hukou system laws by moving to the cities to do work. But what happens is a lot of those employers are hiring gray market people, basically. So they're not entitled to give them anything. So there's a huge gray/black market of people that are working with no rights inside of places that are very far from home. We've had examples with companies, for example, that one you worked at, where the girls that go move from the rural countryside go to work at this specific company, and they're completely taken advantage of and can't do anything.
Yeah, and they're held like prisoners.
Even the police system, like for example, I was in a police station and they had this guy strung up by his ankles and were beating him with a pole. And the reason that they were doing that was because he didn't have a local hukou, a local household registration system. So the police can get away with whatever they want because this person isn't registered to that area.
Yeah.
So there's a huge abuse of power there because of that system.
Yeah, that's
as well.
like that boss that I used to work for. He'd keep them basically under lock and key with the threat that if they try to cause any trouble, he can just take them to the police because they're not supposed to be there anyway.
Correct. So. Yeah, the hukou system's a huge mess. They're trying to reform it right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the only people that can really come out of it clean are people that have money and connections anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things she had mentioned. She's like, we can't just move anywhere that we want to.
No,
and
I mean,
it's like, really?
Yeah, most people in the West can't understand that. Like if you're in Philadelphia, there's nothing stopping you from going to California and working there and renting a house. But you can't do that if you're in China. If you're from Philadelphia, for instance, you're stuck there. That's where you're from. And it's very, very difficult, if not impossible to move. You have to actually purchase.
You can, but it's like a big deal.
You have to purchase property, and there's a whole bunch of like rules that you have to overcome and hoops in a specific place in order for you to get that hukou. And it's incredibly expensive. And in the big first tier cities, it's impossible. If you come from a rural place, you cannot afford a house in Xinjiang or an apartment. There's just no way you'd be able to do that. It would cost you lifetimes worth of savings. And so there's no way for you to get that hukou. It's super difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. The real estate story that you told, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit in our somewhat plan here of how to conduct this interview. But I know we may as well go there. So another thing that you have a lot of is in your travels, all kinds of aspects, not only the sort of infamous stories about the ghost cities and things like that, but there's a lot of story about real estate in China in your videos. I guess the big topic, the hot topic right now is the real estate bubble, which I noticed that, what was it? Almost 6 years ago, I came across in one of your videos. You said there's a real estate bubble and it's going to bust, which I didn't realize at the time. But because you were traveling around, I still don't quite understand why it bust, to be honest. But as you were traveling around, you were seeing the problems. How did you know there was going to be a bust? Like, what is that? What is the system? Is it a Ponzi scheme?
It is.
Why did it collapse? Yeah.
I think Winston can actually explain the whole real estate collapse thing or the current bubble right now better than me. But what I can tell you is that in our travels around the country, and you watch New York Times or you read the Wall Street Journal or whatever, they would always have these certain cities that they would call like China's ghost cities. And these are the ones that are indicative of a massive systemic problem and with China's economy. The difference, we would go and see those places, of course, but the really big thing for us is we would go through a random middle of nowhere town in, let's say, Hunan province in the south, and see a ghost city even bigger than the ones that were being reported in Wall Street Journal. Or we'd be in the middle of Guizhou and there'd be a massive, huge real estate development project that's already falling down. We would go up north, same thing. And it's outside of these really famous places that we're getting covered of, like, they show these barren 6-lane highways with like, stoplights or whatever. And there's two people walking down the road. We would see this all the time, constantly and consistently throughout China. We'd leave a very populated, rural, impoverished area full of really awesome people. We'd have really amazing experiences with those people and then go enter these apocalyptic looking concrete wastelands where everything is just basic concrete and rebar and no one's moving in. And the stuff's been made 2-3 years ago and there's no progress on it. Or there'll be an entire area, with a capacity of 10, 15,000 people where it is finished and the cladding is already falling off the buildings. And we would go explore these areas and say, this is worse than what mainstream media is actually saying. And we'd, just from a personal example, watch what family members would do. And for example, my parents-in-law are pretty well off. So what they do is traditionally in China, when you have some money, you invest in property. And they would continually follow this kind of market, this explosion of the market. First, they would buy an apartment for 5,000 RMB per square meter. then it would go up to 10, then it would go up to 15. I believe that my mother-in-law just bought an apartment in this third tier city, and not a super wealthy city. It's okay. For 20 something thousand RMB per square meter.
It's crazy.
And it's not worth that.
No, it's not.
Right.
It's
You can go to other areas that are even better off, that are even cheaper. It's a huge bubble. It is localized sometimes. But what's in the news all the time is Evergrande, right?
Yeah.
And we talked a bit about that. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, look, it's pretty straightforward. The reason why we could see it was a bubble from the beginning is China has very, very little in options when it comes to investment. So basically, if you want to invest money, there's nothing really for you. People don't trust the stock market after the big crash that they had.
Unless you have insider connections.
Yeah, of course. You don't get people investing in gold or anything like that. And so the only thing that people can actually invest in is property. It's become the biggest investment engine
to make money,
in the country. Yeah. Okay. So what happens is, if you've got someone who's got a little bit of money, is they buy these substandard apartments, but because they're so inflated, the prices are so ridiculous. They buy like a really crappy concrete box in the sky. You don't actually own it. You don't own the land that it's on. You simply own this apartment in this building, right? On the 12th floor or the 30th floor or something, but it's a 70-year lease. It actually belongs to the construction company, which then leased the land from the local government. And so the local government actually owns the land that this building was built on, and you bought a piece of that building. So it's a very stupid situation there. You don't actually own anything. But what has happened from the beginning of this boom is, when you buy a property, or when I say property, I mean an apartment in the middle of a building. When you buy this apartment, it's guaranteed to increase in value every year. Okay. Yeah. And sometimes by a huge percent, like 30% or something. We've seen ridiculous things where, in Xinjiang, you've had apartments just like hundreds of percent in a year just go up.
Yeah, in a year. Yeah.
Just because of the crazy real estate market. Okay. So that's what people do, is they buy these apartments as a surefire investment. They know that it's definitely going to make money for them. So they buy it. They don't live in it, right? Or if they do live in it, they buy other apartments. Now, that's the thing, is the statistics are very skewed in China. China puts out a statistic that 90% of the population are homeowners. This is not actually true, because what they're doing is they're basically saying there are X amount of apartments that are owned by people and X amount of people. What's actually happening is the people in the urban centers usually own 2 or 3 apartments each.
Right.
Okay. So that's why it looks like 90% of the population has a house, but that's not actually true. That's just a kind of an bunch of elite people have multiple houses. So there's still plenty of people that don't own houses.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? That's kind of what's going on. So when the people get money, they buy the apartment, they sell it for a massive profit. They use that profit to go and buy more apartments. And then you'll find that the city centers where they originally bought their apartment, like Shenzhen, is now too expensive for them to afford to buy properties there. So what they do is they take their profits and they go out of the cities to the cheaper areas and buy multiple apartments in the cheaper areas.
Endemic.
And then what they do is they sell those multiple apartments later when the profit's good enough. And then they buy more, and they buy them in the more far-flung areas. And that's why these ghost cities end up getting built in these kind of way out there areas, simply because it's cheaper. And no one ever lives in them. They're garbage. Right. They fall apart eventually,
Yeah, we've explored on the ground. Now, Joanne, but I know this is not an open forum, but there's probably people listening that are like, well, there's certainly government measures in place to actually deal with this kind of endemic investment,
speculation,
out of control speculation. And there are. The problem is in China is, I can't overstate this really. The corruption is so rampant that if you have government connections, especially local government connections, and money, you can get past all these measures. So China can say, oh, you can only buy a house or an apartment once every 2 years. Let's just make a hypothetical situation. And you can't sell it with a certain amount of time, or you have to pay double tax on it. There is always, every single time, a way around that.
What was that government official that had like 56 houses or
Correct.
something?
And that's a famous example. But at a lower level, like our clients we'd build motorcycles for, these guys would have 10 properties flipped in 1 year, which completely goes against all the government regulation, right? And if you ask them about it, they would just laugh. Of course they do. They have connections. They have guanxi, it's called.
Exactly.
So in China, you can't really look at public data. You can't really understand government regulation until you understand the fact that the rich do everything that they want to do.
You're either government or you're little people there.
Right.
Government can do what they want.
Or government connected.
Yeah, that's government connected. But even when rules are put in place, they're very easy to break. So they put in rules like, for instance, one married couple household can only purchase 2 properties. So what do? They get divorced on paper so that they can buy more.
Very easy to get divorced.
Yeah, it's very easy. So they could then go and buy more properties, that kind of thing. They use fake IDs. They get their uncles and so on. They get other people to buy in their names.
Take someone out to dinner.
Yeah, just give them a cut or whatever. There's so many ways around it. But of course, the government connections and the corruption is the number one way. So this is crazy. And that's why when we started to see these ridiculously badly built, crappy apartments going for what you would pay to get a coastal elite house in California or New York, for a really rubbish apartment, we knew it's a bubble. And this bubble's been growing and growing, and the government keeps bailing it out. Every time it looks like it's going to burst, the government steps in and either does something like cools the market down, or they give some kind of and when it cools down too much, then they heat it up again by giving like a no interest rate loan situation, all sorts of things that happen. But the government is always there to stop this bubble from bursting. But it's kind of got to a point now where it's just unsustainable. It's absolutely ridiculous. The amount of debt that's going on, the amount of projects that are currently on hold because of debt. They can't pay the workers and things like that. It's reached a point now where the government has again bailed out Evergrande.
I was going to say this to finish this off. Yeah. The bailouts are very much imperial. It's completely against what the Chinese government stands for.
Yes.
The socialist principles of socialism with Chinese characteristics, the Chinese Communist Party, their principles. A corporate bailout is quite literally against everything that they stand for and what they tell their people. So you see these bailouts happen, but they're not necessarily public bailouts.
Yeah, what they've done is, because they control the banks, obviously, all the banks belong to the Chinese Communist Party and they do what the Chinese Communist Party says. So what they've done in this instance is they've actually gotten the banks to either cancel the interest that the Evergrande and so on has to pay on their loans, or the government has on the slide paid off that interest for Evergrande just so that the loans can continue. So this is the kind of thing they do. And then they don't have to publicly go out there and say, we bailed out Evergrande. All they've done is in the background, slyly instructed the banks to bail them out.
How about that? Wow. I mean, a lot of it sounds familiar, right? Like you said, we've seen this before. But one of Xi Jinping's big, his flagship thing, I thought, was anti-corruption, which I was born a skeptic. So I'm like, well, I hope so. I hope that's the case. But I've also seen situations where, how many times have politicians claimed that his political enemy was corrupt and you got to take him down when really that person wasn't even quite corrupt, or they're both just as corrupt or whatever. So I don't believe that. Here's
I have a little insight on that if you want to talk about the anti-corruption thing.
Yeah, I do. Is it?
Okay.
Is it an anti-corrupt? I don't know what you call. Is the top of the Communist Party now out to cut down corruption, or are they just taking advantage of it themselves to take out their enemies?
Yeah, a roundabout way of answering this is Winston and I both didn't live in China because we loved the government leadership. We lived in China because we enjoyed our life there. We had friends and family, and it was a great place to be. That being said, we did see under Xi Jinping's leadership things get to the point where you can't ignore politics anymore. So government policy becomes a part of your life. Whereas, yes, China was always super authoritarian and quite bad under Jiang Zemin, under Hu Jintao, the previous leader, but it didn't enter your personal life necessarily.
Yeah, it was kind of relaxed.
It was kind of relaxed. It was all there on paper, right? It was still very much
not
dictatorship.
Enforced.
It just wasn't enforced. But under Xi Jinping is where you saw this stuff happen. And you might think that something like an anti-corruption campaign would be a net positive, because corruption is rife in China. It's
Yes.
quite literally how the country works.
Yeah,
It's
it could not operate without corruption.
Right. And that's not necessarily a good thing.
No, it's terrible.
The thing is, it ruins a lot of people's lives, and people in China are absolutely tired of it. They don't want to go through red tape and pay bribes for everything they do. So on paper, we were both excited. I'm not going to say excited, both positive, optimistic about Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive when it first started, and as was everyone else. The problem is, we do have a lot of credence behind what we say, because we've been in dinners where government officials were talking. We've been around influential people that have discussed how this has affected them. Yeah, you get a couple drinks and people and they talk, right?
No, never mind. Just go to the hospital and you have to pay the hongbao just to get a successful surgery.
Exactly, that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
Long story short, we've heard what people have said, how this has affected them, and specifically in some government departments where I know people that they work in, the anti-corruption drive did take some people out. Now, these people were, of course, corrupt, because you have to dip your toes in.
Everybody is corrupt. Everyone in the Chinese government is corrupt, bar none. There's not a single one that doesn't have some kind of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, kind of an arrangement going on. Taking bribes or doing favors for favors. That's how the government works. Every single person, you could point a finger at every single official or Communist Party member and say, there's some corruption going on, and you'd be right. That's just how it works.
And that's not a personal deficiency. Yeah. That's quite literally, like you said,
how the system works. Yeah.
So this anti-corruption drive started weeding out all of these people, but what actually they were either political opponents of Xi Jinping or his crew, basically. So people that were attached to Xi Jinping in some bizarre way. They could take out political opponents within their government sectors, and those people that came out of that unscathed ended up more privileged and more well-connected under this distilled version of the Chinese government that was before kind of this gray cloud, right? You could float around it. Now, as a distilled line, you have to be well-connected to Xi Jinping and his cronies all the way down to the provincial level or even town level. Yeah. So we saw people lose their jobs. We saw people get propelled up. And what it did really was just amplify corruption with people with the right connections. It was not at all some sort of way to weed out like systemic corruption within China. Yeah. And in fact, it made things a lot more bureaucratic and worse because it gave power, really like pure refined distilled power, to people that need to work on behalf of Xi Jinping's policies. Yeah. And Xi Jinping's policies are inherently much more strict, and definitely worse for foreigners living in China than the previous leadership. So that's why I said it really affected our lives personally. That was a symptom of the paranoia was a symptom of Xi Jinping's policies as well. Correct. A foreigner going around, traveling freely around China with a camera was enough to get the SWAT team on you, because Xi Jinping was concerned that China's image wasn't good enough. We could see that in his policies like 讲好中国故事, which is like tell a good China story, which basically is this nice way of saying only show the good parts of China that are like pristine and shiny to the rest of the world. We got caught up in that kind of stuff. Absolutely. Because we weren't working with the government. So it really was all connected to that. And the optimism for Xi Jinping quickly turned into pessimism, not amongst just us, but amongst the general populace as well. But they can't say anything about it.
Yeah, this is probably too hard to boil the question down, but so there was across the board kind of chill corruption all along, like in many systems. Like I live in New Jersey, so we tolerate we hate corruption too, but it's just there. We tolerate a certain level of it, and then it'll go over the top, and then maybe it gets called out. So it was sort of like that in China before, and then it got to the point where nominally they were calling out corruption, but it just became a more polarized corruption, if you will. Is it worse now? Are the people, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question. You probably know what I'm asking, but is the corruption overall worse now or better for the people in China?
It's better for people that toe the line and do not ask any sort of questions. So any room for liberalization is gone now. Yeah. It's much worse for people that did not step out of line, but people that were doing things their own way. Right.
That this whole anti-corruption drive has become a weapon to use against people. So that's actually made things a lot worse. So, of course, everybody's still corrupt, but it's more underground now. Okay. So when corruption and bribery happens, it's more... it's done stealthily, so to speak.
And it's the people that are allowed to get away with it.
Yeah, and of course, if you're part of the Xi Jinping group, you can do whatever normal corruption, bribery crap that you want. But it keeps people in line because they know that if they step out of line and they say something that Xi Jinping doesn't like, or they go against one of his policies, or they say something that goes against him, they're going to be the next one that's going to be accused of being corrupt. They're going to have their head on the chopping block next. So it's actually just a very successful tool to control the narrative of the government.
It's also created policies which have led to basically a narc society.
Oh, yes.
Ratting each other out for reward.
Yeah.
Wow. One more before we totally move out of the real estate realm. I understand the speculation and how the bubbles were burst. I'm very surprised that it's just a simple calculation of number of people over number of property owners or number of properties owned. That's how they calculate the percentage of the population who own their homes. I mean, that's just downright.
It's just ridiculous how many empty apartments there are. And that's just because they're investment, speculation investment engines for these people. So that's the problem. When you've got that kind of an issue, you go around any city in the States, you are not going to find that many empty houses or apartments, because those should be used for living,
Right.
We do have that problem, but not on that scale, not that I know of. Maybe some of the highest real estate in the inner cities like San Francisco, New York, maybe, but we don't have it in suburbia, not that I see.
Yeah.
But I guess the one thing I'm still...
No, I'm going to double check my thing. Yeah, but still, there's at least 65 million empty apartments, if not a lot more. In fact, I'm pretty sure that there's a lot more than that.
Yeah, that's a conservative estimate.
That's a very conservative estimate, and you could house the entire population of not only America, but Australia in those apartments that are empty there. So, you've got so many empty apartments, it's ridiculous, with nobody living in them. And it just shows you how ridiculous the actual housing bubble really is.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I'm still not completely clear on, that your explanation was great. But so the companies, the big real estate companies, so and I guess it's kind of the same way here. You put down money and then your house or your apartment gets built, right? So you're putting down money on nothing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Do they pay for it in full before it gets built? And why are those companies, if they are not really part of this whole speculation bubble, why are they going under? Is there still people putting down their down payments?
No, that's the thing. These companies are ridiculously greedy, and what happens is they pay the local governments to lease this piece of land, right? So there'll be a piece of land there. The government clears it. They kick everyone off that's living there. They do whatever they have to do.
That's called the Land Management Bureau.
Yeah.
That's the part of the government that does
This is how the local governments make a huge amount of their money. They lease these bits of lands to these construction companies. The construction company rolls in, and even before they break ground, they put together these big events, these kind of parties where they invite people to come and take a look at their plans. And they've got, they'll have all the architectural drawings. They'll have little models of what it's going to look like. And then all these investors come in there and they buy up the properties before they're even built, before the ground is even broken, right? So they buy them up. A lot of them just put down a deposit, which is it has to be a very big deposit these days, like 30% minimum deposit or something. The rules keep changing. Sometimes if it's a very well sought after property development, they can ask for a much higher deposit, or they can even have it all fully paid up front, depends. But the thing is, people go in there, they put their deposits down. Now this real estate company has everyone's money, okay? And then they put it into building the actual building, and they do it with the cheapest materials possible. They do it as quickly as possible, the most amount of shortcuts. That's why the building quality is so bad, because they obviously want to keep as much of this money as possible. The problem is these real estate companies, they use this money for all sorts of crap. They build, like for instance, Evergrande opened up an electric vehicle, like a Tesla type thing. They poured tons of money into that. They set up their own football team, a soccer team, which of course they spent tons of money on building football stadiums, doing all sorts of weird stuff. They take this money and they spend it on lavish lifestyles. They spend it on corruption. They spend it on these weird little side projects rather than putting it where it's supposed to be, and that's how the money gets lost. And then they just take more loans and they use their building properties as collateral or whatever they do. They keep taking more and more loans to just finance all these weird and wonderful things that they try and do because they're not very good at managing the money. That's how they end up getting bankrupt like this.
Okay.
To really cap off the real estate thing, I think Evergrande is a great analogy for how China works in general.
Yeah.
I know a lot of those are dollar denominated loans too, and that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, I appreciate that. So we still have some time.
Mhm.
As I said, I've had all these topics I want to talk to you about, but
Sure.
we may have to narrow them down a little bit. I mean, we have to talk about the escalating hostilities between the US and China,
Okay.
the West and China.
Yes.
And to me,
The
it looks like a
developed world
sudden
in China, really. I mean, think about it. Japan as well.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like a sudden shift
Mhm.
because, I mean, there was trouble boiling for a while, but still the officials here were still, interested in the investments in China. And it seemed a little fake for a while. Then Trump came in and of course it heated up. And we thought that things were going to calm down when the Biden administration, the quote unquote Biden administration came in, but it hasn't. It's gotten even maybe worse. What happened?
That's pretty straightforward. Whenever there's trouble in China, when it comes to the governance of China, so for instance, if people are starting to see the quality of life is downgrading, there maybe isn't as much money going around anymore. Maybe there's some food shortages. Maybe there's some problems with electricity and energy shortage, real estate problems. The government has one surefire tool to use every single time to get people's attention away from these problems, and that is to cause some kind of a ruckus and blame the West or blame Japan, blame an outside force. Okay. And this is something that's been happening in China for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's nothing new. So, China, the way China works is it's got a very us versus them society. Okay. They call themselves Zhongguo, the middle kingdom, for a reason. They believe that it's the center of everything and everything outside of China is an outside force. Okay. And this is what happens. Now you've got all these problems around you. Very easy. All you need to do is say, look, it's because Japan is doing this, or the Americans are doing this, or whatever. So you can always lay the blame somewhere else. The local population, their anger, their rage, their disappointment, all gets focused on America, gets focused on Russia, gets focused on Japan, gets focused on France, you name it. There's always a different flavor of the week. And then the local government emerges unscathed from all of these scandals and all these problems because suddenly it's someone else's fault. And that's what they do. And this is a big issue that I've been seeing. Well, from the minute I landed in China, I noticed that there was this horrible xenophobia, jingoism, all this kind of stuff going on a daily basis, just on the TV. I mean, you can back me up here. Absolutely. But you turn on the TV, every single day, you see these War of the Resistance dramas that they have, which are these hyped up, completely unrealistic TV shows about how Japan is doing bad things, and then these farmers and these local peasants come and slaughter all the Japanese and do all this crazy.
With no foreign aid.
Yeah, exactly. And how this kind of ridiculous thing, just to keep the embers of hate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like they bring children to anti-Japan war museums where they look at mutilated corpses and babies that the Japanese soldiers murdered and all this stuff. And they bring 5-year-olds to there.
And then they get them to stab straw man Japanese, like literally straw men, like men, like a scarecrow with bayonets and stuff, It's this kind of hatred and warmongering really is going on all the time. And it's
to create a switch.
Yeah. And recently it's been big against the US, okay? And using Taiwan as the flashpoint, okay? That's the catalyst. They've just released this incredibly ridiculous movie which has smashed the Chinese box office. It's about the time when China sent its volunteer troops into North Korea to go and attack the Americans, okay? And of course they all froze to death, and that's because of the bad leadership. In fact, because they were trying to rush the troops into North Korea to go and fight the Americans, they told a lot of the soldiers, they ordered them to leave their winter jackets and stuff behind because it was slowing them down. So when they arrived there, it was like the harshest winter in however many years, and tons of them froze to death. I mean,
It was a meat grinder.
Yeah, and the real estimate of the amount of deaths is anywhere from like 35,000 to 150,000 Chinese troops died, and they were actually the elite troops that were sent in, and that was versus a small army of Marines of how many were there? Like
I can't remember.
a small amount, basically, like 10 times of them of the Chinese side died, and it wasn't actually due to fighting the Americans. It was actually due to the weather and poor planning and bad leadership. But they've twisted this around, made this massive nationalistic movie about how well the troops fought and all the hardships they had to go through to fight America. And it's, again, stirring this whole anti-American sentiment. I know for a fact, I've got friends that are telling me on a daily basis that the kind of news programs that are coming on TV, the kind of TV shows, the documentaries that are showing are all about like how bad America is and Taiwan and all this kind of stuff. You see the news popping up every day is all about how bad America is, you know, the things that they're doing, all the military moves. And so the government is very, very, very clearly painting the US and the West in general and developed countries in general as the enemy. And it's a daily thing. Okay, while we in the West here are worried about saying anything that might be construed as racist or anything that might upset the Chinese government to make them think that we're not treating them as equals or something like that. On the flip side, in China, they are pushing on a daily basis to paint the West as enemies, as other, and stoking up xenophobia, nationalism, and all of this other kind of stuff. So the warmongering in China is real, and they're doing this to prepare their entire populace for the possibility of a conflict breaking out over Taiwan.
And this, how does this relate to, as a good setup, because how does this relate to American policy towards China? So we're talking about the current Biden administration. We're talking about other countries that have kind of diplomatically come together to recognize the Chinese government as potentially being a pretty terrible entity on the global stage in how they're acting. Well, this happened because I feel like when people were finally bitten financially, this became an actual reality. So the xenophobia and the policies under Xi Jinping have not made it conducive for foreign investment or to be a foreign company or an entity operating out of China. The preferential treatment, I mean, there's protectionism and then there's the way that China does things. The 51% domestic ownership over any foreign entity, all of these horrible things that people have put up with over the years just to get a piece of the Chinese market was already unpalatable enough. But it was kind of it was almost like it was good enough to take that risk. It was good enough to at least get a return on your investment. But with Xi Jinping's policies, it's made it so just not a positive experience for these companies that it's basically enough's enough. So when you have entities that just don't find favorable conditions in China and leave China for other countries, even like places like Vietnam, which is also another one-party state, but is more open to foreign investment, it becomes aware to, I think, policymakers that, okay, all of this, the human rights abuses, the domestic things that China does to its own populace, the preferential treatment, the abuse that China hurls and accusations that China hurls. Look at COVID origin accusations that China does, blaming Fort Detrick in the US, blaming Italy, blaming Japan, blaming India. Blaming Australia, this infantile response from the Chinese government, and then also the non-favorable conditions for companies to operate out of China, make it so all of these unpalatable things that foreign companies didn't like previously, or foreign countries in general didn't like previously, becomes overwhelming. It's just to the point where it's a bipartisan issue. And Winston and I always talk about this. We are not politically aligned for the very reason that you lived in China 14 years. I lived in China for 10 years, and I saw what the Chinese government has become. And it is very much an actual issue that people do need to pay attention to. Foreign governments, policymakers, people in general that have money tied up there. China has become something that it wasn't before.
Yes.
And I think that finally has started to enter the zeitgeist in international politics. And I don't think we're going to see a flip on that, simply because of the way that Xi Jinping consolidated power and how he wants domestic control more than he wants China to necessarily be a force to be reckoned with on the global stage. That's both a double-edged sword. That's a positive thing, because I personally don't think we're going to end up in a wartime scenario with China anytime soon. But it's also a bad thing. It's a bad thing for foreign investment. It's a bad thing for the local Chinese populace that is currently being kind of suffocated in China to the point where it's Stockholm syndrome. So I think that, I don't think we're going to see foreign policy ease up on China unless it's a government, maybe a more corrupt government in a developing country that's beholden to the Belt and Road debt.
Yeah,
things like that.
Here's the thing that's ridiculous, though. China's been taking advantage of the developed world for far too long. All right, they've gotten preferential trade agreements, okay, through the World Trade Organization, because they claim to be a developing country. Okay, this is something they've been doing for decades. And in the beginning, it was true. The difference is China is the second largest economy in the world. How is it a developing country? On top of that, they've got a space program. They're sending probes to Mars, for goodness sake, and people to the moon and all this other nonsense that they're doing. How is it a developing country that needs to be given all these preferential trade agreements and treated as if they are, and even the worst part of it is people are sending foreign aid. It was just last year that the UK stopped sending aid, and they were sending like 70 million pounds worth of aid every year, foreign aid to China, the second largest economy in the world. It's really, for lack of a better word, taking the piss. China's there claiming to be so great, so powerful, so amazing with this big military and space program and everything. And on the other hand, they're holding out their hand and saying, we're poor, give us money, give us preferential trade treatment.
The Chinese government's having its cake and eating it too.
I know. And the rest of the world's just kind of going along with it. And it's been absolutely disgusting how Western corporations and, well, like I keep saying Western, but I mean, I have to include Japan and every other developed country out there. Just how they have been bending over, ignoring the terrible things that China's been doing in Xinjiang, Tibet, to Hong Kong, breaking all of its promises.
Taiwan threats.
Yeah, the threats towards Taiwan and the saber rattling and all that, the crap they're doing in the South China Sea, building artificial islands, arming them with missiles and airstrips and things like that, forcing local fishermen out of their own territorial waters in that area, sending their fishing fleets around the world to the Galapagos, for instance, and draining the ocean of sea life and biodiversity, doing all these terrible, terrible things to the environment, increasing their coal usage and output year on year, hand over fist, creating all these terrible, terrible situations. And they're never, ever taken to task on this because the greedy corporations just want to get their shoes made there cheaply,
And that's changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could argue with you on a lot of these things, but you're here because I want to hear your view on it. But because there's provocation, it looks from this side, it looks like provocation, the South China Sea. I don't really know why it's our business to police and, run ships through and host ships and run through the Taiwan Strait and all this stuff. It looks like a provocation. Well, but I didn't understand what was going on the China side, to see if this was a dance that was going on, or whether it was just from the interventionist faction of people here. It looks like strict provocation with no reason.
Well, I mean, you have to understand that what China's doing there is provocation. They're setting up man-made islands in other countries' territorial waters, and then claiming that it just belongs to them. That is intervention right there. That's the big problem. And those shipping routes have been guarded for the longest time and made safe for everyone.
I get the non-interventionist idea. The problem is that it's if we're just looking at it from the American hegemony aspect of things. Yes, I mean, there's a lot to be said for, America pretending to be the global police and all this kind of stuff. That being said, these countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, all of these areas, all these countries in the region do not want China to keep expanding into their territory. The Blue Water Navy, the American kind of presence in the area
now
is
NATO really. It's
NATO, much preferred by these countries than China just breaking all of the rules in the region. That's the issue.
Yeah. because they've completely forced fishermen out of their own territorial waters from the Philippines and Vietnam, et cetera, in that entire
Those
area.
local countries should have a say.
Yeah, they don't. They get bullied by China, and that's the big issue. So when it comes to intervention, look, I'm not American, so I can speak from an outside perspective here, and I can say that it's good what America's doing there is because it's keeping a level playing field for everyone. If they didn't go in there and keep testing the waters, so to speak, literally, there would be big trouble because China would just rampantly take over everything in the area, because left unchecked, China will do whatever it wants. And this is something that we've seen over and over again. You know, when you don't challenge them, they just keep pushing. People didn't challenge them about the Uyghurs. They built all these concentration camps. They didn't challenge them about forced labor. It was rampant. When you don't challenge China on certain big issues, they just go with it. They run with it because they, as a
That's
government,
what authoritarian control is.
Yeah, as a government, they have no real moral compass. It's all about power. It's a terrible, terrible situation.
This is a good time to ask you. I'm not sure if you actually went to Xinjiang, but
No.
have you, see, here's the thing. There's been some research done on the claims of being made about genocide, particularly the genocide claims in Xinjiang. And it all seems to come from this one guy.
Adrian Zenz.
Yeah, Adrian Zenz. And when you look into it, it doesn't really hold up. However, you know, if it doesn't get to the point of genocide, I mean, obviously that's good if it's not genocide, but if there's still terrible things going on, and there was a recent AP sort of deep dive, I believe it was Associated Press, where they said that they went back to visit this reporter that had been there repeatedly and saw a big change. They were sort of, they were chilling out a little bit. They were closing some of the re-education camps and things like that. Not that it had actually gotten that much better, but that sort of goes along with what you just said, where if China gets called out on something, you know, they may make a change. Otherwise, it'll just
visibly.
Yeah, visibly. Yeah, that's the thing. Again, you see, people are so quick to try and dismiss the whole claims of genocide. Like you said, you look into Adrian Zenz and some things don't add up. That doesn't stop the fact that you've got something terrible happening there, a cultural genocide, okay? There are concentration camps / re-education camps. The Chinese government has confirmed this themselves.
They're in documents.
In the beginning, the Chinese government denied their very existence, okay? So remember, you can never take their word for it. They denied that those existed only after huge amounts of international press and people trying to push them on it. Then they admitted that they exist, but no, they're just vocational camps, you see?
And call it what you want. I think that it's a very not good thing. Well, personally, knowing Uyghur people, by the way, in China, our stuff doesn't come from Adrian Zenz. It's talking to Uyghur people, right?
I'm not even familiar with Adrian Zenz's work myself personally.
Sure, he keeps getting cited, obviously.
Yeah, he gets cited, but we actually have friends that are Uyghur activists. And so when you know real people that have actually had their families disappeared, then you know it's real. And it's not some made up fairy tale that some Adrian Zenz guy on the internet or whatever made a thing about. It's actual real people that have been affected. And when we say a genocide, we're not talking about taking people out in the backfield and shooting them all in the head. We're talking about a cultural genocide where people are forced to abandon their religion, forced to abandon their language, forced to abandon their traditions,
their families,
forced to abandon their families, forced to integrate and become something they are not. You could take any ethnic minority around the world from whichever country. I can use America as an example. If you were to go to the Indian reservations right now, force them to not speak Navajo or Apache or any of their languages. They're not allowed to talk that anymore. They're not allowed to wear traditional clothing. They're not allowed to dance and do their traditional
They have to become
things.
Christian.
They have to be Christian. They have to speak English only. They're not allowed to have their traditional learnings in their books anymore.
And they are forced into marriages with Han Chinese people who live in their homes.
Yeah, take the men, the Navajo men or whatever, take them and put them in vocational camps, force random white missionaries to go and live with the women and the children in their houses and marry them and so on and so forth. This is a direct analog that I can now make, which I think anyone who can see what's going on there would realize how terrible it is. exactly what they're doing to the Uyghurs. They are erasing their culture, trying to force them to become something they're not. And it's government sponsored. They've got nowhere to go. They've got no human rights organizations in China standing up for them. They've got nowhere to turn to. They have to, under armed escort, do these things. The police and the military are there checking their IDs, checking their papers every day, making sure that they don't,
surveillance everywhere.
they don't say anything that's not Chinese. You know, this is a cultural genocide, and it's way worse than most people think it is, because, you know, when you don't understand China and you don't understand the differences in language, and if you have a Eurocentric view, like most people living in America, they can only think about American issues, and they can only think about the world from an American point of view. It might not seem like a huge issue to you, but if you know the situation there, and if you could try to draw an analog like I did there with the Navajo peoples, then you could maybe see how bad it is, because that might put it into your perspective. You know?
I don't want to harp on this too much, because Winston and I get quite passionate about this, but when we have debates or conversations with people, and this is not with you, Joanne, this is just maybe for your audience, if you have any skeptics out there.
Yeah.
You have to understand that it's a very narrow mindset to pretend to be a skeptic and to pretend to be like, I need to have my sources and facts checked, when it's about something that is controlled by the Chinese government. Because if you look at it from an American perspective, you put on those Eurocentric blinders, like you said, then you're only getting that sort of perspective. So it means that you discount anything that can't be proven. You discount anything that can't be, you know, summarized in some sort of hypothesis, like some sort of journal, right?
Yeah.
And you ignore the fact that there are human beings with souls that are talking and telling their stories to people, and are completely, they're completely getting eradicated. Their voice is getting eradicated. Their stories are getting eradicated. And when they speak out, their families go away. Those kind of anecdotal pieces of evidence are enough for me as a human being. You know, I'm not a journalist, right? Are enough for me as a human being to pay attention to what they're saying. And then actually, after 10 years in China, to believe what they're saying, because I know what xenophobia is stacked up against the Uyghur people in China that are already dehumanized from the lowest level of society to the top. They are always have been treated like cattle and animals, like thieves, like criminals. And you've had Uyghur friends in China too, right? The amount of animosity that they face is even worse than even like an African American in China. It is, they are labeled immediately as you know, thieves, with skepticism, as being a thief or a criminal. And when you're kind of born into that society where the government actually rewards people for thinking and acting like that, of course the government policies are more in favor of that Han ethnocentric line, because that's what we saw, and that's what's in the government documents, and that's the goal of the governments in China. So you can say Adrian Zenz, you can use whatever you know, proof that you want. It's only going to serve the Chinese government's narrative if you completely dismiss people's actual stories about this from a Western perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you having been there and having been there for a long time, your intuition as to whether the Uyghurs that you talk to and the Uyghur friends that you have, that your sense of whether that's genuine or not is really important. I would definitely count that as, you know, important on the evidence side for anecdotes, just like, you know, the young Chinese family who lives here. I mean, that's totally an anecdote. It's only one person, but it always stuck in my mind, you know, like, I think that we do have, you know, there's some real value to that intuition and people who are honest about things. And we do have a sense of it. It's, you know, it's hard to use it in court, you know, things like that, but
agreed,
it is important.
You really have to take a look at it from another perspective as well, is that China has complete control over the media in China, right? And even foreign media. If you're a foreign journalist going into China, they know who you are, and where you go to report, they make sure that things are laid out so that you can see them in a certain way. Remember, and I hate to use this as an example, but during the whole World War II situation, people didn't know that the concentration camps for the Jews existed until it was over, right? And before, when there were rumors, they put out these propaganda things like that Theresienstadt video, which showed how happy the Jews were in these vocational camps where they could learn different skills, and where, you know, they had nice bedding and clothing and all this stuff, and they could,
how they're being integrated.
Yeah, exactly. You can look at that propaganda and draw complete parallels with what China's been putting out with regards to the Uyghurs. And again, it's not a free society where you have different press. Here in America, you've got Fox News, you've got CNN, you've got all these different ones that can attack things from different angles, right? So they can go out there and talk about something freely. In China, you cannot. You've got one, and it's state-controlled. It's not privately owned. It's state-controlled media. It can only say what the government allows it to say. They may not show China in a negative light at all. So they could never, ever bring to light the bad parts. And so when you look at Chinese media, a lot of people probably look at it and they think it's like Western media, where you're going to get a fairly balanced, a biased, sure, but a fairly balanced idea of what might be going on, but you don't. You only get one view of what's going on. And like I said, foreign journalists that try to go there and do any kind of expose.
I have an anecdote for that real quick. I can't mention any names or details just to keep this person out of it.
Yeah.
But this person was tasked with going to Xinjiang. He's also, I believe he's been to places like North Korea before as well. And he said that if you are a journalist, then everything that you see ahead of time and after you leave has been Potemkin village set up, basically. They would orchestrate car crashes to divert them away from where they were going because they knew that they were going there to film or take pictures. They would orchestrate people to talk to actually get in their way, to get them away from talking to certain people and kind of changing the narrative to be able to have this kind of scripted conversation. Everything was so premeditated that you can't even trust if a foreign journalist just randomly shows up there to do something. China knows about it.
They know
because of the entry-exit system, because of the cameras, because of the everything. Everything is tied together to the central government, or at least the provincial government in a room sheet.
Whenever you travel in China, first of all, if you stay in any hotel, you have to use your passport to register. You may not stay in a hotel unless you do that, okay? They have what's called a temporary residence permit that every single foreigner has to abide by. When you come in within 24 hours, you have to report to your local police station where you are. If you don't do it yourself, it's done automatically whenever you book into a hotel or something like that, okay? They know exactly where every foreigner is, and they know exactly what visa they're on. They know exactly what they're up to.
Think about that remember when the SWAT team busted on us? They took our passports, they scanned it, and they called the police station. They tell, hey, there's foreigners here, and within minutes they're there.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, why are you here? Right?
Yeah, that's what happened.
The same thing.
And they knew everything about us, our wives, and everything like that.
They knew where I go grocery shopping.
Yeah, that's the thing. They keep tabs on everyone. So when you're a journalist and they flag you with a journalism visa, they know exactly where you are, exactly where you're going, exactly where you're living, and they've got people watching you. So they make sure that you don't see something or report on something you're not supposed to. And that's why we were lucky enough, because we weren't journalists, to go and see and film what we filmed.
Yeah, I definitely heard some of the things, the tactics that you use, like not staying at hotels and things like that.
Yeah.
You also mentioned they're still tracking you even after you've left China, which
certainly.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But just to say one more thing about the anti-interventionist movement, which is transpartisan, by the way, pretty much nonpartisan. We're all pretty fed up with all political parties.
Sure.
But we have the war machine here, right? We have a lot of people who are making a lot of money off of war and want to keep wars going, right? Mm-hmm. So we also have regime change operations going on where I not enough time to go into all of that. But we also have like situations where there are defectors who are they're helped to defect. And then they become these celebrity defectors, and they tell these stories that are like, some of them are really outrageous, particularly in some of the ones from North Korea.
Sure.
So our defense is up against something like that.
Agreed.
The main thing is, I think the main goal is, to oppose these it's hard to say, you can use the old military industrial complex, if you will, but just to oppose war for the sake of war, because, we're the interests of the regular people, some kind of fairness. We're not pie in the sky, rose colored glasses on everything. We're pretty realistic people. So it's not necessarily like that we're a bunch of Sinophile commies or whatever. It's just sort of, we see some things going on that we recognize, we think we've seen before, and drumming up war. with China that would benefit, the same people who have been doing this concentration of wealth and power
Sure.
up to the top and leaving everybody else in the dust, immense suffering. So that's the kind of dynamic that's going on as to why we're
I don't
skeptical.
think Winston and I would disagree with that.
No, not at all. Not
No,
at all.
I doubt you would either.
Remember, I'm not American, right? So I know Americans are the most critical of their own government, to be honest. The rest of the world just kind of is whatever, that's America doing what it does. You guys love to criticize your own government for the bad mistakes and the bad actions of the government, which is great. That's what makes America so good, is that the people of America hold the government accountable for its actions. And that's something that's
not too successful lately, but yeah.
That's the thing, is that it's still possible, though. You cannot do that in China. You realize that. You can't even speak up against the government. It's not possible
at all.
Now, here's the thing. Yes, this whole military industrial complex and the war being the best business where you can make the most money and all that is a real thing. And I'm not discounting that at all. And yes, outrage can be generated. And of course, there are certain things like with the Iraq war and so on, where things were fabricated in order to kickstart a war. And we understand that. But what you're seeing with China is not that. Okay? It's absolutely not that. I can tell you that because of the experience that I've had living there. And I can tell you that because of what I've seen. And something that you have to realize as well is that China is doing exactly what you are accusing the American military industrial complex of doing. They are actually doing that. Okay. And they are doing it in a huge way. And they're doing it openly every single day by publishing all these stupid things on the phones to people, by putting out these terrible documentaries and newscast programs that are calling America the enemy and riling everybody up with these super nationalistic movies and things like that. They are looking to prepare their entire populace for war. And so while everybody else is debating on whether or not things are a good thing or not, China's actually doing these things. So you don't want to be caught sleeping, or you don't want to be caught in a situation where you're fighting so hard against your own government that you let someone like China come and steamroll you because you're too worried about.
Who is doing the exact same thing.
They are actually doing these things. When you're in China, you see billboards all about join the military because we're going to fight our enemy type thing.
Yeah, you can't drive down the street in New York City or whatever and see a billboard. You might see a billboard that says join the Marines. It doesn't say let's go kill Chinese people.
Yeah.
Right. In China, you see billboards, you see propaganda, at least painted on the walls and stuff, that say we need to destroy the enemy, right? With the military, we need to kill the enemy.
Look at the military of China, how it's growing so fast. All the money that's been pumped into, building the biggest navy in the world, into building all of these.
It's a neo-colonial power as well. Yeah. Look at what they're doing in Africa.
Absolutely,
enslaving good chunks of the population. Our friend in Ghana was telling private militias being set up by the Chinese government to actually enslave African people in these mines and then keep other people out, right? It's resource gathering. It's everything, every single system symptom of American imperialism that you hear about is actually what the CCP is doing currently.
This is the thing. I fully understand the caution that, anti-interventionists would have, considering the track record of the United States and the previous wars and so on. And so you would think like, they really are trying to manufacture consent for war by talking about a genocide in Xinjiang and so on. The fact of the matter is, though, that it's not just some American government thing trying to generate this kind of thing. This is people from all around the world are affected. People from every walk of life that know anything about Xinjiang, or anyone who's connected to Xinjiang or that region of the world, will know that this is something that's affecting people. It's not only Xinjiang, though. We've seen this with what they've done with Hong Kong, breaking their promises of the 50 years of autonomy, completely broken, and stifling freedom over there. The constant saber rattling and threatening to attack Taiwan, sending warplanes over there all the time into their airspace, things like that. China,
that's what stoking war is.
What they're doing on the border of India, where they're doing that salami slice tactic, where they keep taking little bits of land, constantly having military clashes with them. We're not dealing with a peaceful nation that's just sitting back there and saying, "Oh, you know what? We're just peaceful, wonderful people, and we don't want conflict with anyone." No, we're talking about an expansionist force here that's pushing itself out into the South China Sea, pushing itself out into Africa and developing countries, taking over doing all sorts of these nasty things. Okay. And so if you want to really stop any kind of conflict, we have to call China out for its bad actions and stop blaming the American military industrial complex for trying to make stuff up. Because actually China's making its own stuff up. It's actually doing it. And what they're doing is real in many, many different fronts, not just the Uyghur genocide thing, so many different things that we can look at. I mean, just the way they treat prisoners, organ harvesting of the prisoners and stuff. I'm not even going to talk about persecuting religions and things like that. I'm just saying there are so many things that China needs to be called out on. And we cannot silence ourselves and make excuses for their actions because we're worried about, the military industrial complex or the bad actions of the American government. Again, I'm not American. So when I speak calling out China and talking about these things, I'm not speaking as an American. So, yeah.
I got one last question for you. If you have time to do a bonus question, is that all right?
Sure.
All right. So we started hinting about this in just this past few minutes. So there's another big question, a big sort of argument going on in the faction of people that pay attention to the wars.
Mm-hmm.
And that is China an imperial? Does it seek to be an imperial power? Is it an expansionist power? But I'd like to add another little bit on that if I can. If it doesn't make sense to put these two together, just let me know and it'll be no problem. But the question is like the alliance of Russia and China. There's long been this fear of, we can't among the top level strategists, the at the very top level, the whole world island thing, we have to control Central Asia, because if you control Central Asia,
sure,
you control the world, all that. So there was always this great fear of Germany and Russia coming together because the US and the West could never overpower that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, an alliance with Russia, and they didn't really even talk about an alliance with Russia and China because they were such enemies at the time. Mm-hmm. But now we have, Russia and China, mm-hmm. and it looks like an alliance. It seems to me when I look at the geographical issues of this giant sort of empty territory and this, giant, super crowded, less resources. I don't mean, that looks like a problem waiting to happen for me.
Okay.
But right now they claim to be great friends and allies. But, are they going to turn into a military alliance, or are there some real problems and maybe they won't be great allies going forward? Your thoughts on that? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, definitely.
Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
I'm hoping that
nice talking to you.
Your firsthand experience is invaluable to us, whether we agree or we don't agree. There's always going to be some common ground. Mm-hmm. I'm a big proponent of that. I'll put all of your links and things like that in the show notes, but if you would just, tell people that you're much more well-known than I am, but make sure that everybody knows how to follow you, how to find your work, how to support you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I guess the easiest way, we have our personal channels. My one is Serpentza, or ZA, as you would say in America. Mm-hmm.
Mine is Laowhy, Laowhy 86.
But we would love if you could join us on our podcast, which happens weekly on a Friday, mm-hmm. and that is ADV Podcasts, because that's when we get to sit down and actually discuss all the latest current events in China and put our perspective on them and involve everybody who, comes and watches.
Yeah, exactly. The long form is when you can really help people understand, I think, and understand more yourself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Okay, well, we'd love to talk to you again and really appreciate it. It was great meeting you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You too. It was lovely to be on the show.
Nice meeting you.
Mm.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Winston and Matt. Follow them on Twitter. Follow Winston at Serpentza and follow Matt at laowhy86, that's LAOWHY 86. Subscribe to their YouTube channels, ADV China, ADV Podcasts, Serpent VA, and laowhy86, and find their work on their website, advchina.net. This is a fully independent podcast, and in this age of censorship, your support is really more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to the bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram at t.me/aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Happy holidays.